The Suffolk Pod Show is produced and managed by podtalk.co.uk. I'm Mark Mason.
And I'm Susanna Hornby. Episode 1. Talking to Phil Harding, globally renowned music producer and sound engineer who worked and still works with some of the biggest names in the pop industry. Rick Astley, Kylie Minogue, Pet Shop Boys, Jackson 5, Depeche Mode, ABC, E17 and Boyzone, just to name but a few. Now living in Suffolk and teaching across the UK as a leading educational music production, Phil has just published his second book, Pop Music Production, which we cannot wait to hear more about. We're delighted to introduce to you Dr. Phil Harding, aka the Mixmaster. Hello, Phil. How are you?
Hi, Zana. That's a lovely introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, it's
very well, thanks.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honour to have you with us on the Suffolk Pod Show. I think the last time we saw you was in Bury St Edmunds many, many moons ago. So it's really good to be talking to you again.
Yes, it was at a gig, wasn't it? What venue were we at? Can't remember now.
We were at the Queen's Head. My brother was playing in a band and you kindly came along and lent an ear.
Yeah, very good. A good evening.
It was a good evening. Phil, there's so much we can talk to you about. You have an incredible ocean of stories and experiences. Could we just rewind right back to the beginning and tell us, where everything started for you in the music production world?
Yeah, sure. I was very lucky as a 16-year-old leaving school in Dagenham in Essex, get the opportunity to get some interviews in London via my education officer at the school. They sent me to some pretty strange places that weren't really, I said to them I wanted to work in the music business. My careers officer, that's the word.
Yeah.
He sent me to a place in Wardour Street in Soho that made cables for PA systems and studios and so on. And after that interview there, which they said, we don't really think you're going to be technical enough for us. But there's a recording studio behind us, the back of the famous Marquee Club, and we hear that they're looking for a new assistant. Here's the phone number, here's the name of the manager, give them a call. So one of those opportunities that, I say to students, when an opportunity is presented to you, and it could be a life-changing opportunity, you really have to grab it with both hands. So I put the call in as soon as I got home, managed to get an interview the next day. I was the last person to be interviewed out of about 20, and I got the job. So,
wow.
So that was it. 1973, believe it or not. And so the job then, it was like an unofficial apprenticeship, but you were called T-boy, tape-op, runner, assistant engineer, tape jockey, all kinds of words were used. And it was a fantastic studio. I mean, apart from being connected to the club where we did live recordings with people like David Bowie and Rod Stewart, big stars like that, it was one of the major studios, and I was very lucky to be learning not only under some great engineers, but Gus Dudgeon liked the studio, and he was the producer for Elton John and Kiki D and people like that at that time. With the whole kind of tax thing that was going on in the UK at that time, artists like Elton John would record in France and America and places like that, and then Gus would bring the tapes back and mix them at the Marquee. What a fantastic person to learn under. My immediate desire within a short space of time was, okay, my next step is to move into the engineering chair. That's what I'm learning. But my ultimate goal would be to become a producer like Gus, if at all possible. So as the 70s went on and, my learning time went on, I finally got my chances to get in that engineering chair. It took almost 4 or 5 years, which is really comparable to what it takes for students now. If a student stays on for A-levels and goes to university to study music production, it's 5 years before you would go into the industry. They might choose to do a great FE course like we have at West Suffolk College in Bury St Edmunds, instead of staying on for A-levels. And, I've taught on that course, and it's quite comparable really, except I was learning on the job, no official training, just watching what was going on, sitting at the shoulders of the engineers and observing and finally getting my opportunity. So when I got my opportunities in the late 70s, we were in the punk revolution and the disco age.
Yeah.
and I worked on a number of those different types of things, but hence I've got the Clash and bands like Killing Joke on my CV, who would come into studios like the Marquee, and part of that punk thing was that we're not going to go into a studio with some corporate rock producer, just book a studio and a young engineer and we produce it ourselves. It's pretty weird, pretty crazy, but a very fast learning curve for young engineers like myself. So in no time at all I'd sort of progressed progressed to more senior engineering jobs, working with Toyah and quite a lot of pop. And then it was in the early 80s I met Pete Waterman before he teamed up with Stock Aitken, and got to know him well and done some projects with Peter Collins that he used to manage. But when he teamed up with Stock Aitken in 1984, we spent almost a year at the Marquee Studios. You know, in the early incarnation of the team, I was still what we called a house engineer at the time, still on a wage.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the time we got on to Dead or Alive, and number one was Spin Me Round by 1985, Pete and the boys decided that they would no longer hire the Marquee and set up their own studio in South London,
right,
called PWL Studios, and asked me to join them as their chief engineer. So I broke my contract with the Marquee, which was quite a difficult time because I'd been there 12 years. But again, I could sense, a bit like when I first got the opportunity to get the job, I could sense the opportunity. You know, I call it a gut feeling.
Yeah.
Following your passion. You know, the first day we arrived at PWL, Pete Waterman said, right, I'm not paying anybody except for the girl that's going to be down on reception, Sherry, and everyone else is going to have to go self-employed. This was 1984, 85. That was the start of being self-employed, but actually initially earning less money than I earned at the Marquee. So it just goes to show sometimes, you know, I'm kind of giving you the spiel I give to students. You might have to take a step backwards to go further forward in your career if you're really following your gut feeling that something's going to work well.
Yeah.
You know, and within 18 months, 2 years, we were having tremendous success with Mel and Kim and then Rick Astley, and it just went on and on into the late 80s, and that was a fantastic decision.
You're listening to the Suffolk Pod Show, talking to music producer Phil Harding.
My first book covers my period in the 80s that I'm talking about there.
Yeah.
And that book is called PWL from the Factory Floor. And that's had a bit of a sort of a new lease in life after getting a lovely YouTube review from an influencer in Norway. And it's re-kicked that book into life, quite apart from my new book, which is great. So having spent, pretty much all of the 80s from day one that PWL Studios existed through to the early 90s, and we hit a kind of point where that kind of happy, poppy sound of PWL and Kylie Minogue and Jason Donovan and all the rest of it kind of very quickly went out of fashion, and the media and people became less interested in it, and, you know, Kylie wanted to be less poppy and more disco and more credible and a more sexy image and all this sort of thing. So, by this time I teamed up with Ian Kerner.
Yes.
You know, as a fantastic keyboard player and co-producer, and we had become a team at PWL. We were kind of a Stock Aitken Waterman B team. Yeah. And so we left in 92 and set up our own studio, and we were called Peony Music, based at the Strongroom Studios in Shoreditch. Went on from there. I'm gradually getting us to where we are now.
No, I was going to say, I wanted to ask you kind of touched on it really, because somehow people fell quickly, not sort of out of love with the Rick Astleys and the Kylie Minogue, that kind of, as the music was then. What shifted it into the 90s, which is such, to me, a different pop culture? You were there, you were doing it, and you were working it. What made it change?
Well, I think we had saturated the market so much with the PWL pop sound.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, people called it manufactured pop, and it was, you know, and we were nicknamed the Hit Factory. We were literally, you know, we went from one studio to 4 studios, you know, started off in 1985 with 6 people and had staff of like 50 to 100. So it really become a production belt. And, you know, I think people got fed up with that sound. You know, it doesn't seem to happen so much now, but moving into a new decade then seemed, you know, it was really marked as a different thing. And I think pop culture and everything else that was going on in the early 90s just said, oh, God, you know, give us a different sound. And acid house and that underground dance scene and all of that was one of the big things that came in the late 80s and really rose to a big height in the early 90s. And although we attempted to sort of run with it, you know, we weren't that hardcore. We were pop, you know.
Yeah, no, correct.
And rock came back, you know, and hence Britpop in the 90s. And you had Oasis and Blur and
sorry, one of my favourites.
So what really happened, I would say, with pop is it went, you know, and we went with it. It went the boy band direction, as opposed to all of those kind of solo artists and a few bands that were around. The real start of the boy band explosion was New Kids on the Block from America.
Absolutely,
and they were late 80s into the early 90s. And what happened at the record companies and with the managers was, oh God, we've got to have a UK New Kids on the Block. They're from America, but they're the biggest band in the UK and Europe at the moment. And we're the UK boy band. So hence managers like Nigel Martin Smith, who put together Take That, and Tom Watkins, who we worked with E17. Suddenly all these boy bands appeared. And in those early days at the Strong Room, myself and Ian worked with both of those bands, in fact. We remixed the first E17 record, House of Love, and that was a big hit. And we did a little bit of work with Take That on their first album. Not much, just a few little bits. And then what happened was Tom Watkins, so thrilled with what we did with House of Love, because we turned it around from a sort of pop hip-hop track to a kind of mega Frankie Goes to Hollywood pop track. That's what he wanted. It wasn't necessarily what the band wanted, but it's what he wanted. He had managed Bros and Pet Shop Boys, so he had a fantastic knowledge of the pop market. And he said, guys, I've got to manage you. You haven't got a manager. You've just done a fantastic job here. Let me manage you. And then he said, well, if I'm going to manage you and I'm managing E17, you can't work with Take That because we're about to go to war with them.
Yeah, of course.
I know that sounds drastic, but that's the way.
Oh no, that's how it was. You were one or the other, never both.
That's how it was. So we spent the next 3 years working with Tom and E17, fantastic other projects like Juice and other pop projects that we did at the time. Right through to the off the second album, we had the number one at Christmas was Day Another Day, which was a fantastic peak. First number one that I'd had as a producer, myself and Ian. We felt like we'd gone from the SAW B team at PWL to the Tom Watkins A team, and it was a great feeling.
The major league, basically. And it's an incredible song. Sorry, I just want to dwell on that, the Christmas song. It's still played today, every Christmas.
That's a great thing with having a Christmas hit.
Yeah. Everyone should have one. I do hope you make a few quid every Christmas out of it, or I like to think that you do anyway. Anyway.
We do.
Oh, good. Okay. The 90s was extraordinary. I mean, you kind of, you're at the zenith of your music production career at this point, and on you went very strongly with many of them, including, I'm even reading here, Boyzone. You worked with them.
Yeah, that was it was a very intense year, 3 years with Tom Watkins, and by the time we got to the third E17 album, and there were lots of band infighting. I mean, we see this on these BBC4 programs about music on Friday nights, these fantastic insights of what goes on with bands, especially in pop. Whilst we were making that third album, Ian and I realised that we were at the end of the road with E17, as far as we were concerned, and with Tom. And so we moved on, only to discover for Boyzone's early work, Louis Walsh was desperately trying to get hold of us to produce them.
Okay.
And, this is the kind of what goes on behind the scenes. And Tom Watkins was blocking him, basically saying to Louis, look, if you want my boys to produce your band, this is the way he would talk, you got to give me co-management of the band. And of course, Louis didn't want to give that away. So literally the minute that the news went out that we were no longer managed by Tom Watkins, Louis Walsh was on the phone to us saying, boys, we're on our second album and I'd love you to work with Boyzone. And one of the first tracks we did with them was their cover of the Bee Gees' Words song. And that was their first number one and our second number one, which was fantastic. And I've often said, this is in my new book, which is partly a memoir. We used to listen to the charts on a Sunday night on Radio 1. Gosh, if you were number one, fantastically, you were last on the programme. And literally as the programme finished, my home phone went and there was Louis and the band, the lads from Boyzone, on the phone congratulating myself and Ian for getting them to their first number one, which was a lovely moment. We had a good relationship with Louis for a couple of years, and it was interesting. He was never interested in managing us. He just was happy getting us working with Boyzone and so on. By the end of the 90s, we got kind of boy banded out, or certainly I did, because what tends to happen when you've worked your way to a situation like that in the music industry is that the record companies and the managers, forever looking at the charts and who's producing what, who's writing what songs. As far as the industry was concerned, we were boy band producers. That was it. We were off pretty much no other work, especially after that Boyzone number one, other than boy bands. And both of us, but certainly me, getting fed up with, why can't we work with some solo artists? Why can't we work with some girl vocalists? Why can't we work with some girl bands? And it just wasn't happening. It's strange. We even signed our own female solo artist and took the tracks around to record companies and they said, well, great songs, great production. She sounds great, but it doesn't sound like Harding and Kerno.
Oh, cool.
In other words, it wasn't a boy band. And, we see these kind of things sort of, taking the mick out of on comedy things on the TV, but that is really, unfortunately, the mentality of some people in the music industry. And even by the end of the 90s, in fact, we worked on a hat-trick production on TV for Channel 4 called Boys Unlimited, which was a kind of a mockumentary on a manager putting together a boy band.
Right.
So we had the bravery to sort of take the piss out of ourselves. We had to fight hard to get that gig, and one of the members of that TV boy band was James Corden, funnily enough.
You know what? I'm recalling this. I must have been far too old to watch it, but it was fascinating. It was.
He was cast as the fat one, which was always considered to be Gary in Take That. And I know Gary's never, he might have been a fraction chubby, but he's never really been fat.
He's always been beautiful in my eyes.
Yeah, he's in fantastic shape now. But so we had a tremendous time working on that. But we got to the point by the end of the 90s where, we were being offered boy bands from Germany and boy bands from Belgium and all the rest of it. And personally, I just couldn't take any more. At that point, I started to get involved in a little bit of education. I'd gone up to LIPA up in Liverpool, which is the performing arts university that Paul McCartney funded. And I did my first ever masterclass workshop where I took in a 911 track we'd had a hit with and showed the students. So, this was the demo we got from the songwriter, and this is how we worked it into the final record that went into the charts. And I was nervous as hell going in there. I mean, the demonstration was in a studio, so at least I was on familiar ground. But quickly realised over the 2 days that I was there that this was really useful to the students beyond their fantastic tutors that they have and all the facilities they've got. There has now been, in 20 years plus that I've been involved in trying to link education and industry, a good flow of industry people going into universities in particular and just demonstrating to the students the reality of working on projects in the industry, which is hard to reproduce just in an educational environment without industry people coming in, topping up, as it were, the regular module teaching that the students get. So, so I've been very involved in that ever since, really.
Yeah, and you've also, you have important roles with James. Tell us a little bit about that. What does that involve?
Yes, James stands for Joint Audio Media Education Support.
Yep.
And we are basically an industry body on behalf of Music Producers Guild and other organisations within the industry that try to link industry and education. And what I just described at LIPA, that's one of the things that we do. So we have a pool of people that will go out and do that kind of workshop and demonstration. But mainly we offer industry accreditation, really built to be quite a big thing in the last 15 years. So we'll send some industry practitioners in to assess a course, a whole 3-year course. They'll look at all the paperwork, they'll go in and meet the team, meet the students, look at the resources, etc., make recommendations. Our goal is to make sure that the music production courses that apply for this are working at industry standards that are current.
So important now, so they don't walk out with just theory. They can actually take to the job as they leave college.
Yeah, exactly. And the HE course at University of Suffolk, which is based at West Suffolk College there in Bury, is accredited by James, and it's a course that I would highly recommend to students.
You're listening to the Suffolk Pod Show, talking to music producer Phil Harding.
We must talk about your books, and particularly your latest book. You've just talked to us in depth about the 90s. Tell us more about what urged you to write this book and what's within its pages.
Yes, so in the last 20 years, getting more and more involved in education, we actually closed our studio at the Strong Room in 2000, so I've only worked from a home studio since then, but I've kept my hand in doing productions and so on, but got very involved in education, and I've got good friends at Leeds Beckett University who back in 2014 made an offer that I couldn't refuse. I had turned it down from a previous university, but the offer to do a PhD by portfolio, and that means that you can take the portfolio of your professional work into a PhD study, and I was allowed to write a thesis about the boy bands and manufactured pop of the 90s that I worked on, and that was a fantastic experience. I had a lot of support from all the people there at Leeds Beckett, did a lot of research, a lot of interviews and so on, and completed that PhD in 2017 with the hope and in mind that I might be able to turn it into a second book. But unlike my first book, which was basically a memoir, about working at PWL in the 1980s, the second book is called Pop Music Production, and it's come out of my PhD. I'm very lucky that I managed to get Routledge, who are an American academic publisher, to publish it. So it's a cross between an academic book, part memoir, part instructional. So what I've been able to do is to round up most of my working practices from the 90s onwards into quite a clear form in terms of how you go about doing a vocal pop session, full chapter on my mixing techniques, which is called my top-down 12-step program. And ever since the 90s, in fact, when I mixed that Stay Another Day by E17, which was so vocal heavy and vocal led, I was under time pressure to mix that record, and decided if I do the vocals first, just balanced and all of my processing against a simple keyboard pad or a piano, then I'll build the rest of the track around it. And it really worked out fantastic because people have never heard actually the full version that was recorded also contained Phil Collins type drums and a bass.
Okay.
But, there were so many vocals and so much orchestration that I never got on to actually putting the drums and the bass in. It's a funny little story because I went off on holiday literally the next day to the manager in the record company, this vocal orchestral version, with the keyboards, everything in other than drums and bass. And I said, well, I'll mix the final version, Tom, when I get back from holiday. And 2 weeks later, I got back and rebooked the mix studio to do it. And he screamed down the phone at me. He said, Phil, don't touch a thing. Everybody loves it.
As it is.
Exactly as it is. We don't want to run the maze. So, and it worked. Obviously, it did work, and that's the record we all know. Pretty much since then, every record that I've mixed since starts with the vocals, and that's why I call it top down, because traditionally in mixing and music production, you would mix what we would call bottom up. In other words, the drums.
Yeah.
So it's been very traditional in pop and rock. You work on the drums first, then you work your way up to the vocals. This technique of starting with the vocals and working your way down to the drums, it has many benefits, not least of which is the fact that you're always listening as a mix engineer to the song. And it's very easy to lose. Yeah, it's very easy to lose sight of the song when you spend hours working on kick drums and snare drums and all the technical stuff to make the drums sound good, and you're not really focusing on the song. Yeah, so I've got a chapter of a full sort of 12-step program that takes you from vocals right down to drums. And by the time you get down to drums, and this does work in lots of different music genres, the drums take less time and seem a lot less significant than when you start with them. And, this is one of the messages I've been taking around to universities and students, because I did a tour to promote the book. I generally leave those kind of workshops saying, well, if you've never tried it, at least try it once. Start with a vocal and work everything around it, because, it does suit a lot of music, and gradually I think the message is getting across. I'm meeting more and more people that do use that technique. I'm not saying I invented it, but... No,
I was going to ask, have people actually fed back to you how much it's worked for them?
Yes, people have. And, sometimes when let's say a group of 10 or 12 students, there'll only be one or two that might have tried it and maybe didn't get on with it. But generally I get feedback coming back from students and from the lecturers that this is working well for people. So it's a good thing. So that's the kind of instructional how-to things. The memoir stuff is a bit like the sort of, I was talking about Louis Walsh there and so on. So there's lots of little stories in there like that. And the first chapter spends a long time looking at pop culture and how we got to the point of the boy bands of the 90s, because since I've finished the PhD and had the book out and done a lot of radio interviews and so on, people have said, yeah, but boy bands have existed since the Monkees and since Bay City Rollers and all this sort of thing. But the point is, my research tells me that we didn't call them boy bands until the 90s.
No, we didn't.
No, exactly. And we might say now Bay City Rollers were a boy band, but they were just a pop band. It's a terminology that's we're used to now in culture. So, like any good researcher, I give a good history of pop culture from the 50s through to the 90s. And then, like anyone doing a PhD, the idea of a PhD is that you give a new contribution to knowledge. That's the task you're set with at the beginning. I've come up with a system that is basically a theory, which is called the service model of creativity and commerciality in pop music. And that sounds a bit long, and I've probably got a couple of words wrong there, but the key word there that's not used much in music is service. I say to students that it is a service industry. You may think that you're on a happy-go-lucky creative music course, but actually when you get into industry, you are providing service to clients. And in my view, not enough people look at it that way. So that theory and that model, which is fully described in the book, has gone down very well generally in academia. And I've had the opportunity. Yeah, and I've had the opportunity to test it out in a couple of universities as well, where I get teams of students working in teams of 4 towards the same project. The idea of the service model is you have a team leader, very much as I've experienced in my career. So Pete Waterman clearly was our team leader at PWL. Tom Watkins was our team leader through the E17 days. And I've got a current production team called PJS, and I'm the team leader. And the idea is that the team leader does all of the, not just the business, but the creative negotiation with the client, whether that be artist, manager, record company, whatever, and then feeds all of that information as required to the creative team. So my ideal team is generally 4 people: the team leader, 2 musicians, one working on that's a good keyboard player and programmer to get everything programmed into the computer, and one that is a rhythm specialist, programming the drums and so on. And then the 4th person is generally what we call in the industry a top liner. And a top liner is somebody that concentrates on the melody and the lyrics, and they'll often be a singer themselves. So I lay that out as that's an ideal team for a pop or dance songwriting and production team. And that's those are the type of things I try to get across in the book.
And I'm sure it all comes across brilliantly, as you've just explained. And don't tell us any more, because otherwise we don't need to buy it. So where
who wants you to buy it?
Where do we buy your book, or how do we?
Well, apart from the usual places, Amazon and so on, or from Routledge, what I would prefer is that people go to my website, which is philhardingmusic.com. So that's Phil Harding Music, all one word. And I've got a very nice web shop on there set up by a good friend of mine. And you can buy a signed copy of the new book. You can buy a signed copy of the previous book about PWL. And there are various offer packages of both books and some CDs, etc., etc.
It's a really, really good website. I was on it. It takes a couple of hours to get through it. So that's always a sign of an informative site, Phil. Before we say goodbye,
thank you,
that's okay, anytime. Before we say goodbye, obviously you're doing all your teaching and lecturing. Are you still producing music? Are you working with anyone in particular?
Yes, I'm doing less and less, really. There's a couple of things coming. I mean, the PGS team, myself, Simon Dalton and Julian Wiggins, all based in Bury St Edmunds. We've done quite a bit over the last 8 years, but we're mainly set up as a retro remix and production team.
Right.
We've done a remix for Rosella, 90's dance artist, who's got a new album coming, and we're delighted to have worked on a mixed version of what's going to be, I think, her next single, and it's a Lamont Dozier song, Lamont Dozier of Holland Dozier Holland from the Motown days, who's a good friend of mine. So that's coming, I think, before the end of the year. We've also worked with a new rock band called Fet 47. And their products coming out next year. So, yeah, quite a few things like that going on. And I used to be in a band which is called the 24 Club.
Yeah.
And if people go to Bandcamp and look for the 24 Club, we had an EP out in 2018, and we're working on a new EP at the moment. And that's a band that I play bass in.
Right.
I am a musician as well. There's three of us, and we produce and write the songs together. And we've been archiving a lot of our sort of old material from way back in the, believe it or not, late 70s, early 80s, and bringing it up to date, which has been good fun, actually.
Yeah, I bet it has.
So,
I bet it has.
So lots going on, as well as that, yes, as you say, my academic work.
Yeah.
I get invited to write chapters and academic journal pieces, and I'm working on 3 of those at the moment. So keeping busy, Zana.
You are, and all of this, I thought we were talking to you whilst you're on holiday.
Well, I mean, I'm very lucky to have a little holiday lodge out on the coast, as well as mainly living in Bury St Edmunds. But it's a good place to specifically do my academic work, actually. But so yeah, I'm always happy to keep engaged.
Your creative space. Phil, thank you so much for being with us. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. You've told us so much, and I am going to go and buy that book now. Quite excited about it. But thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, yes, been a great interview. Well done.
Thank you. All right, speak to you soon.
To find out more about Phil Harding and to buy his book, visit philhardingmusic.com.
Thanks for listening to the Suffolk Pod Show. Find us on Facebook and Instagram, or visit our website, podtalk.co.uk. And here's our disclaimer.
The Suffolk Pod Show will not be held responsible for any omissions or errors in its podcasts.
The Suffolk Pod Show is produced purely for entertainment purposes. Views and opinions are that of our own or of our guests.